December 1974, Vostok Station, Antarctica. The drill had stopped moving. For 3 days, the thermal boring system had been jammed at 952 meters depth, suspended in a borehole filled with aviation kerosene and freon mixture that prevented the ice from collapsing inward. The cable tension was approaching the breaking point. If it snapped, 30 months of drilling would be lost. 952 meters of borehole rendered useless, the drill assembly unrecoverable, the entire project potentially finished. The men working the winch knew that Moscow was watching, knew that the deep ice core drilling program at Vostok was a demonstration of Soviet technological superiority, knew that failure wasn't acceptable. They increased the tension past the red line on the gauge. The cable sang with strain. Then something released deep in the ice and the drill broke free, rising toward the surface with 952 meters of ice core. Ancient frozen atmosphere from 10,000 years ago, from a world before cities or agriculture. Nobody at Vostok Station in 1974 knew they were drilling toward the largest subglacial lake on Earth. Nobody suspected that beneath their feet lay a body of water the size of Lake Ontario, sealed under ice for 15 million years. They were just trying to extract climate data without losing equipment in the coldest permanently inhabited place on the planet. But 18 years earlier, a Soviet scientist had seen something in seismic data that would eventually rewrite our understanding of what was possible beneath Antarctic ice. The third Soviet Antarctic expedition. Andrey Kapitsa, son of Nobel Prize-winning physicist Fyodor Kapitsa, led a traverse across the Antarctic plateau, conducting seismic surveys. The expedition's goal was mapping subglacial topography, determining the thickness of the ice sheet, understanding what lay beneath the frozen continent. The method was straightforward. Set off explosive charges, measure how long seismic waves took to travel down through the ice, reflect off bedrock, and return to the surface. The time delay revealed ice thickness. The character of the reflection revealed something about the bedrock below. In one location, approximately 3,500 meters above sea level, on the East Antarctic ice sheet, the seismic return showed something extraordinary. The ice was nearly 4 kilometers thick, expected for this region, but the reflection from the bottom was wrong. Bedrock scatters seismic waves, creating diffuse, complex reflections. This reflection was sharp, clean, strong, the kind of reflection you get from a smooth, flat surface, the kind of reflection you get from liquid water. Kapitsa ran the survey multiple times, checking for equipment malfunction. The results were consistent. There was something beneath the ice that behaved acoustically like a large body of water, which was impossible. Water couldn't remain liquid under 4 kilometers of ice at ambient temperatures of minus 50 degrees Celsius. Basic thermodynamics said it should freeze solid. Kapitsa documented the anomaly carefully. He suggested in his reports that there might be liquid water beneath the ice sheet, kept liquid by geothermal heat and the insulating properties of the ice above. Then he filed the data and moved on, because in 1957 nobody had the technology to investigate further. The reports were classified and archived. For over a decade, they gathered dust, while the Soviet Antarctic program pursued other objectives. Then in 1970, the Soviets established a deep ice core drilling program at Vostok Station, built precisely at the location where Kapitsa's seismic surveys had shown the thickest ice, not because of the water anomaly, which had been forgotten, but because thick ice meant ancient ice, and ancient ice meant climate records extending back hundreds of thousands of years. Vostok Station sits at 3,488 meters above sea level. The average annual temperature is minus 55 degrees Celsius. The coldest temperature ever reliably recorded on Earth's surface was measured there, minus 89.2 degrees on July 21, 1983. The station sits on ice that descends 3,700 meters to bedrock. The men who worked at Vostok weren't explorers in the romantic sense. They were technicians, scientists, drill operators doing brutal industrial work in conditions that treated human physiology as an engineering problem to be solved through layers of insulation and careful rationing of warmth. The drill tower was a metal structure barely heated above outside temperature. The drilling fluid, aviation kerosene mixed with freon, was toxic. Long-term exposure caused neurological damage that wouldn't be fully documented for years. The work itself was repetitive, technical, demanding absolute precision, because mistakes at depth meant equipment loss and months of setbacks. Progress was measured in meters per week, sometimes meters per month when equipment failed or ice conditions caused jamming. The drill would descend, melt its way through ice using a thermal element, extract a cylindrical core 5 centimeters in diameter, then be raised to the surface. Each core section represented years or decades of accumulated snowfall compressed into solid ice. By 1980, the borehole had reached 2,000 meters. The ice at that depth had fallen as snow 120,000 years ago, during the last interglacial period, when Earth's climate was warmer than today. The air bubbles trapped in the ice contained atmospheric samples from a pre-industrial world, allowing scientists to reconstruct ancient carbon dioxide levels, temperature proxies, volcanic ash layers from eruptions that had occurred when Neanderthals still walked Europe. The cores were extraordinary scientific achievements, but something else was appearing in the data that nobody initially understood. Below 2,000 meters, the ice changed character. The crystal structure was different, larger, more uniform. This wasn't metamorphic ice formed from compressed snow. This was congelation ice, formed when liquid water freezes from below. Grigory Barkov, a glaciologist working at Vostok, noticed the transition. He analyzed the ice cores carefully, measuring crystal size, orientation, isotopic composition. His conclusion: below approximately 2,500 meters, they were drilling through ice that had formed not from accumulated snowfall but from frozen lake water, which meant there was, or had been, liquid water beneath the ice sheet. In 1974, Soviet scientist Igor Zhodakov published theoretical calculations suggesting that geothermal heat could maintain liquid water at the base of very thick ice sheets. The ice acts as insulation, trapping heat rising from Earth's interior. The pressure of several kilometers of overlying ice lowers water's freezing point. If geothermal heat flux is sufficient, liquid water can exist even when surface temperatures are far below zero. Barkov retrieved Kapitsa's old seismic surveys from the archives. He overlaid them with newer radio echo sounding data collected during the 1970s. The anomaly was still there, a massive radar reflective feature directly beneath Vostok Station, extending roughly 250 kilometers in length and 50 kilometers in width. In 1983, British scientists using airborne radar imaging independently detected what appeared to be a large subglacial lake in the region. The radar returns showed a perfectly flat surface beneath the ice, impossible for bedrock, exactly what you'd expect from liquid water finding its own level. The evidence was accumulating. Seismic data from 1957. Ice cores showing lake ice below 2,500 meters. Theoretical calculations demonstrating liquid water was thermodynamically possible. Radar surveys showing a massive flat surface beneath the ice. There was a lake under Vostok Station. A lake that had been isolated from Earth's surface for an incomprehensible span of time. In 1991, Russian scientist Igor Zhodakov and others published a paper formally proposing the existence of Lake Vostok. They estimated it at roughly 10,000 square kilometers in area, comparable to Lake Ontario. The ice above it was 3,700 to 4,200 meters thick. The water depth was unknown, but potentially hundreds of meters. The lake had been sealed off from the atmosphere since before Antarctica glaciated into its current form, possibly 15 million years or longer. The implications were staggering. If Lake Vostok existed, it represented a completely isolated ecosystem that had been evolving separately from the rest of Earth's biosphere since the Miocene epoch. Any life in the lake would have adapted to absolute darkness, extreme pressure, near freezing temperatures, and complete isolation from atmospheric oxygen or nutrients, and the drill at Vostok Station was descending directly toward it. By 1989, the borehole had reached 2,546 meters. The drilling continued through the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, through the chaos of the 1990s when funding disappeared and supply chains broke down. The Russian Antarctic program persisted on minimal resources, the drilling crews continuing their work because they'd invested too many years to stop. In 1996, the drill reached 3,623 meters, the deepest ice core ever extracted. The ice at that depth had fallen as snow 420,000 years ago, recording 4 complete glacial cycles. The core contained a complete climate archive spanning nearly 500,000 years of Earth's history, and they were approximately 120 meters above the lake surface. 120 meters, after 26 years of continuous drilling through the coldest, most remote ice on Earth. Close enough that the final push could be accomplished in a single drilling season. Then the international scientific community realized what was about to happen, and everything stopped. If the Russians drilled into Lake Vostok using their current methods, using drilling fluid contaminated with kerosene and freon, using non-sterile equipment, using techniques designed for ice core extraction rather than pristine sample collection, they would contaminate one of the most scientifically valuable environments on Earth, an environment that might contain microbial life that had been isolated for 15 million years, life that could provide insights into the limits of biology, the possibilities for life in extreme environments, the potential for organisms in the subsurface oceans of Jupiter's moon, Europa or Saturn's moon Enceladus. International committees convened. Protocols were proposed. Scientific papers argued for contamination prevention measures that didn't yet exist. The Russians were told to halt drilling until proper methods could be developed. In 1998, with the drill 120 meters from the lake surface, the drilling at Vostok Station ceased. The borehole sat frozen at 3,623 meters. The drill tower fell silent. The lake waited in darkness, as it had waited for 15 million years, holding secrets that would require another 14 years of planning, political maneuvering, and technological development to reach. Because Lake Vostok was real, the largest known subglacial lake on Earth, a body of water the size of Lake Ontario, buried under ice nearly 4 kilometers thick, isolated from Earth's surface since before human ancestors walked upright. The Soviets had spent 3 decades drilling toward it, without knowing it was there. They'd reached within 120 meters of one of the greatest discoveries in Antarctic exploration, and now they had to figure out how to close that final distance without destroying what they'd spent 30 years trying to reach. The lake was waiting. It had been waiting for 15 million years. The question was whether humans could develop the technology and discipline to reach it without contaminating it beyond recognition. That answer would take another decade and a half. But in 1998, as the drill sat frozen 120 meters from liquid water that hadn't seen sunlight since the Miocene, one thing was certain. Lake Vostok existed, and reaching it would be one of the defining achievements of Antarctic science. The final approach had only just begun. February 5th, Vostok Station, Antarctica. The drill was descending through ice that had been frozen for over 400,000 years, approaching water that had been liquid for 15 million. Depth, 3,766 meters. The engineers monitoring the pressure gauges knew they were close, perhaps 10 meters, perhaps 20, to punching through the final ice layer into Lake Vostok. 13 years after the controversial halt in 1998, after international debates and protocol development and complete redesign of drilling methodology, they were attempting the final penetration. The pressure differential between the borehole and the lake below was calculated to within specific tolerances. Too much pressure, and the lake water would rush up too violently, potentially destabilizing 3,700 meters of borehole and destroying decades of work. Too little, and the penetration would fail, contaminating the lake without obtaining samples. The drill advanced 3,767 meters, 3,768 meters. The operators watched instruments that measured pressure, temperature, drilling resistance, watched for the moment when solid ice would give way to liquid water that hadn't touched atmosphere since before Antarctica was frozen. At 3,769 meters, the pressure reading shifted, not dramatically, just a subtle change in the numbers that indicated something different below the drill bit. The resistance decreased fractionally. The temperature probe showed a minute increase. They'd made contact. After 54 years, the drill had reached Lake Vostok, but getting to this moment had required solving a problem that seemed insurmountable in 1998. How do you drill into the most pristine isolated ecosystem on Earth without destroying it? When drilling stopped in 1998 at 3,623 meters, the borehole contained approximately 60 tons of drilling fluid, aviation kerosene mixed with freon, toxic and contaminating. Standard ice core procedure would simply drill through into the lake, allow drilling fluid to mix with lake water, extract contaminated samples. For climate research, acceptable. For studying a 15-million-year-old isolated ecosystem, catastrophic. The international scientific community had made their position clear. Contaminating Lake Vostok before understanding its pristine state would be an irreversible loss. If the lake contained microbial life that had evolved in isolation since the Miocene epoch, organisms adapted to permanent darkness and extreme pressure, studying them could answer fundamental questions about the limits of biology, could provide insights into how life might exist in subsurface oceans on Europa or Enceladus. Drilling into the lake with kerosene-contaminated equipment would destroy that opportunity forever. The Russians initially resisted the halt. They'd spent 28 years drilling. The borehole was theirs. They were 120 meters from completion. International pressure to stop felt like external interference in Soviet, now Russian, Antarctic achievements. But Russia had scientists too. Valery Lukin, director of the Russian Antarctic expedition, understood what was at stake. He'd spent years at Antarctic stations, understood the scale of effort required to reach this depth, but also understood that contaminating Lake Vostok would invalidate the scientific value of everything they'd accomplished. The question became, was there a way to reach the lake without contaminating it? Russian engineers spent years developing an answer. The solution was conceptually elegant. practically terrifying. They would drill to within approximately 20 meters of the lake surface, then carefully manage borehole pressure to be slightly lower than the lake pressure below. When they penetrated the final ice layer, lake water would be driven upward into the borehole by the immense pressure of 3,700 meters of overlying ice, estimated at over 300 atmospheres. The water would rush up, mix minimally with drilling fluid in the boundary zone, then rise into colder ice above, where it would freeze solid. Later, they could drill back down through the refrozen section and extract ice that was originally lake water, obtaining samples without introducing significant contamination into the lake itself. It required extraordinary precision. The pressure differential had to be calculated exactly. Penetrate too quickly, and water would surge up uncontrollably. Maintain too much borehole pressure, and water wouldn't rise at all, leaving them with the hole to the lake but no way to sample it without contamination. And it was one way. Once they penetrated, there was no reversing the decision. Lake water would enter the borehole, and they would have to live with whatever happened. In 2006, after 8 years of planning, the Russians received international approval to resume drilling. They began advancing past the 1998 stopping point, progressing 5 to 10 meters per year during the brief Antarctic summer when temperatures rose to minus 30 Celsius and supply flights were possible. The ice below 3,600 meters was under tremendous pressure and warmer than surface ice, approaching minus 2 Celsius near the lake boundary due to geothermal heating. It fractured differently, required constant adjustment of drilling parameters. Each meter deeper took days of careful work. By 2010, they'd reached 3,650 meters, approximately 70 meters from the estimated ice water boundary. The decision was made. The 2011 to 2012 season would be the final push. January 2011. The drilling team arrived at Vostok knowing this season would either culminate 54 years of work or end in failure that would be studied for decades. The drill descended past 3,700 meters into ice that showed transition characteristics, crystal structures suggesting proximity to liquid water below. At 3,720 meters, they stopped and prepared for final penetration. The borehole pressure was adjusted with extraordinary care. Seismic data and ice core analysis suggested they were between 15 and 25 meters above liquid water, close enough that the final drilling phase would be measured in hours, not days. The Antarctic summer was ending. Temperatures were dropping. The last supply flight would depart in early February. If they didn't penetrate now, they'd have to wait another year, maintaining the borehole through winter, hoping it remained stable. February 5, 2012. The drill descended for the final approach. The team monitored pressure differentials, temperature readings, drilling resistance. They advanced slowly, watching for indicators that ice was giving way to water. At 3,769.3 meters, the pressure sensors registered change. The drilling resistance dropped. Temperature increased fractionally. The characteristics were unmistakable. The drill had penetrated through ice into liquid water. Lake Vostok had been reached. Over the following hours, pressure in the borehole increased steadily as lake water was forced upward by the tremendous pressure differential. The water rose through the boundary zone, mixing with drilling fluid, then continued rising into colder ice where it began freezing. By the time pressure equalized, approximately 40 meters of the lower borehole contained frozen lake water. The team extracted the drill and prepared for evacuation. The Antarctic summer was over. They'd made contact with Lake Vostok, allowed lake water to rise and freeze in the borehole. Now they had to leave, let winter pass, and return in 2013 to drill back down and extract samples of the frozen lake water. They left Vostok Station on February 6, 2012, leaving behind a borehole that extended 3,769 meters through ice and contained frozen water from a lake isolated since the Miocene epoch. Either they'd successfully obtained pristine samples of 15-million-year-old water, or they'd contaminated the extraction process so thoroughly that the samples would be scientifically useless. They wouldn't know until they returned. January 2013. The team came back to extract samples. They drilled carefully down through the refrozen section, extracting cores that theoretically contained lake water frozen in place. The ice was extraordinarily clear, clearer than any glacial ice, with visible particles suspended throughout. The cores were packaged under sterile conditions and shipped to laboratories in St. Petersburg for analysis, microbiological culturing, DNA extraction and sequencing, chemical composition analysis, contamination assessment. The analysis took months. The results, when published, were maddeningly ambiguous. The ice samples contained bacterial DNA, thousands of different sequences representing diverse microbial communities. Some sequences matched known surface bacteria, suggesting contamination. Others matched nothing in genetic databases, suggesting either novel organisms or sequencing errors or contamination from unknown sources. The fundamental question remained unresolved. Were these organisms from Lake Vostok, or were they contamination introduced during drilling, handling, or analysis? The scientific papers were cautious. They reported evidence of microbial life in the samples. They acknowledged extensive contamination concerns. They concluded that definitive determination of endemic lake life would require better sampling methods that didn't yet exist. Proposals were drafted for autonomous probes that could melt through ice independently, reach the lake without drilling, sample water directly without human contact. These proposals were technologically challenging and extraordinarily expensive. Funding was uncertain. By 2015, the initial excitement had settled into the difficult work of interpreting ambiguous data. Lake Vostok had been reached after 54 years of effort. Samples had been obtained, but whether those samples contained life from the lake or merely contamination from the surface remained frustratingly unclear. The Russians continued monitoring the borehole, conducting additional sampling seasons, refining their contamination protocols. Other nations developed their own subglacial lake projects, learning from Vostok's successes and failures. And beneath 3,700 meters of Antarctic ice, Lake Vostok remained, 250 kilometers long, 50 kilometers wide, perhaps 500 meters deep, a body of water the size of Lake Ontario, sealed away from Earth's atmosphere for 15 million years, potentially harboring microbial ecosystems that had evolved in absolute darkness since before humans existed. The drill had reached it in 2012, had extracted samples in 2013, but understanding what actually lived in those dark, pressurized waters would require decades more work, better technology, and acceptance that some of Earth's last great mysteries yield their secrets slowly, reluctantly, and never with complete certainty. 54 years to drill 3,769 meters. 54 more years might be needed to truly understand what waited at the bottom. March 2013, St. Petersburg, Russia. Dr. Sergei Bulat held a petri dish up to the light and saw nothing. He'd been trying to culture bacteria from Lake Vostok ice samples for 6 weeks. Standard microbiological procedure: place sample in nutrient medium, incubate at optimal temperature, wait for bacteria to grow into visible colonies. It worked for virtually every environment on Earth: soil, water, extreme heat, extreme cold. Bacteria were adaptable. If they were present, they grew. The Lake Vostok samples weren't growing anything. Either the samples contained no living bacteria, only dead cells or DNA fragments, or the organisms were so adapted to Lake Vostok's unique conditions that standard culturing methods couldn't support them, or the samples were so contaminated that any lake bacteria were overwhelmed by drilling fluid organisms that also wouldn't grow because they were dead from freezing. Bulat set the petri dish down and pulled up the DNA sequencing results on his computer. Those told a different story. The genetic analysis had identified over 3,500 unique bacterial DNA sequences in the ice samples, thousands of different organisms, suggesting incredible microbial diversity. Except DNA sequencing couldn't distinguish between living bacteria and dead contamination. Couldn't tell him if these sequences came from lake organisms that had evolved in isolation for 15 million years, or from surface bacteria introduced during drilling, or from laboratory contamination during sample handling. After 54 years of drilling and 13 years of contamination protocol development, they'd successfully extracted samples from Lake Vostok, and they still couldn't definitively answer the most basic question: does life exist in the lake? This was the frustrating reality of Lake Vostok research. The drilling was the easy part. Understanding what they'd found was proving nearly impossible. The contamination problem had been anticipated but underestimated. When the drill penetrated the final ice layer in February 2012, lake water rushed upward driven by tremendous pressure, over 300 atmospheres from 3,700 meters of overlying ice. The water rose through the boundary zone where drill met lake, inevitably mixing with some drilling fluid before rising higher and freezing. That mixing, even minimal mixing, meant the samples contained kerosene-based drilling fluid compounds. Chemical analysis confirmed it, and where there was drilling fluid, there were drilling fluid bacteria. Organisms that lived in petroleum products that had contaminated the borehole over 26 years of drilling operations. Distinguishing lake bacteria from drilling fluid bacteria, from glacial ice bacteria, from laboratory contamination bacteria was the fundamental challenge, and every genetic sequence found could fit multiple explanations. Bulat's team worked systematically through the contamination problem. They sequenced DNA from drilling fluid samples, creating a baseline of known contaminants. Sequence ice from above the lake boundary. Compared these contamination profiles against the lake water sequences. Some matches were clear. Sequences identical to known drilling fluid bacteria, almost certainly contamination. Sequences matching glacial ice bacteria from above the lake, also contamination. But hundreds of sequences match nothing in genetic databases. Not GenBank, not EMBL, not any repository of cataloged DNA from any environment on Earth. These unknown sequences were either lake organisms that had evolved in isolation into forms unlike anything on the surface, or they were common bacteria whose DNA had degraded during sample processing, or they were sequencing errors, or they were contamination from sources nobody had thought to baseline. The scientific papers Bullitt published were necessarily cautious. Evidence of microbial DNA in accretion ice samples, not discovery of life in Lake Vostok. The distinction mattered. They'd found genetic material. Whether it represented living lake organisms or dead contamination remained unproven. International reaction was mixed. Some researchers argued the sheer diversity of unknown sequences suggested genuine lake life. Contamination shouldn't produce that many novel sequences. Others argued it indicated extensive contamination from multiple sources, plus sequencing problems. The debate was scientifically necessary and personally frustrating. Bullitt had devoted 20 years to Lake Vostok research, had analyzed samples that took 54 years and countless ruined careers to obtain, and he couldn't prove the most basic claim. But while the biological results remained ambiguous, other data was providing extraordinary insights into the lake itself. Chemical analysis of the frozen lake water showed oxygen levels far higher than normal, supersaturated, approaching 50 milligrams per liter. Surface lakes typically contain 8 to 12 milligrams per liter. Lake Vostok had oxygen concentrations that should be toxic to most organisms. The source was ice. Glacial ice forms from compressed snow that traps atmospheric air in bubbles. When ice melts, from geothermal heating at the lake bottom, or pressure melting where ice contacts water, the trapped oxygen dissolves into the lake. Over millions of years, oxygen had been accumulating continuously as ice melted, building to levels unlike anywhere else on Earth. High oxygen meant the lake chemistry was radically different from isolated anoxic environments where most extremophile research had focused. If organisms existed in Lake Vostok, they'd need to tolerate or utilize oxygen levels that were essentially hyperoxic. This suggested metabolism completely unlike the anaerobic processes expected in isolated subglacial environments. Temperature data added another layer of complexity. The ice water boundary was minus 2.9 degrees Celsius, water kept liquid by pressure. But thermal modeling suggested the lake wasn't uniformly cold. Geothermal heat from bedrock below could create warmer zones, possibly approaching 0 Celsius or slightly above in deeper sections. Temperature differences would drive circulation patterns, cold dense water sinking, warmer water rising, creating currents that mix the entire lake over geological timescales. Any nutrients, dissolved gases, or organisms would be distributed throughout the 5,400 cubic kilometer volume. The picture emerging from chemical and physical data was a lake, unlike any surface environment, hyperoxic, near freezing but with thermal gradients, isolated for 15 million years, but continuously fed fresh oxygen from melting ice, under permanent darkness and crushing pressure, but potentially rich in dissolved minerals from bedrock below. All the conditions suggested life was possible, not just possible. In some ways, the chemistry looked more favorable than many surface extreme environments where organisms thrived. The oxygen levels, the potential nutrient sources, the liquid water all supported the possibility of microbial ecosystems. But possibility wasn't proof, and contamination uncertainty meant they couldn't confirm what seemed increasingly likely. Other research groups began proposing solutions. The most promising, autonomous cryobots that could melt through ice independently, reach the lake without drilling fluid, sample water directly under sterile conditions. NASA became particularly interested, not for Lake Vostok specifically, but for Europa, Jupiter's moon with a subsurface ocean beneath 10 to 30 kilometers of ice. If life existed beyond Earth, Europa's ocean was among the most likely locations, but sampling it required technology that could penetrate kilometers of ice without contamination. Lake Vostok was the perfect testing ground, closer than Europa by 600 million kilometers, cheaper to reach. And if contamination occurred, it would only affect one isolated Earth lake, rather than potentially destroying evidence of alien life. Cryobot prototypes were developed and tested in Greenland and Antarctic ice. The engineering challenges were enormous: power for melting through kilometers of ice, navigation to descend straight down, communication through solid ice, autonomous operation because real-time control was impossible, and absolute sterility despite years of operation in non-sterile ice. By 2020, no cryobot had successfully descended more than a few hundred meters autonomously. The technology remained decades from being ready for Lake Vostok depth. Meanwhile, discoveries continued reshaping understanding of Antarctic subglacial environments. Radar surveys had identified over 400 subglacial lakes beneath Antarctic ice. Some were tiny, others rivaled Vostok in size, and evidence suggested they were interconnected, subglacial rivers flowing between lakes, creating a vast hidden hydrological system beneath the ice sheet. Lake Vostok wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was part of a continent-scale subglacial environment that had been completely unknown until the 1990s, an environment that might harbor significant microbial biomass evolving separately from surface life for millions of years. The implications were staggering. If even a fraction of the 400-plus lakes contain life, Antarctica's subglacial biosphere could represent a significant percentage of Earth's total microbial diversity. Entire ecosystems functioning without sunlight, driven by geochemical energy, evolving in isolation since before modern ice sheets formed. And humans had barely scratched the surface, or rather barely penetrated the ice, of understanding it. By 2015, the scientific consensus on Lake Vostok had shifted cautiously toward probably contains microbial life, based on accumulating chemical evidence and statistical analysis of DNA sequences. But probably wasn't proven, and contamination uncertainty meant definitive conclusions remained elusive. Sergei Bulat continued his work, analyzing additional samples from subsequent drilling seasons, refining contamination baselines, searching for the unambiguous evidence that would transform probability into certainty. He devoted his career to Lake Vostok. He'd seen colleagues give up, funding disappear and reappear, international politics nearly kill the project repeatedly, and he still didn't have proof that life existed in the lake. Just increasingly compelling evidence that couldn't quite overcome contamination uncertainty. In his laboratory in St. Petersburg, surrounded by freezers containing ice from 3,769 meters depth, Bulat worked with samples that represented 54 years of drilling through the coldest ice on Earth. Samples that might contain organisms isolated since the Miocene epoch, or might contain nothing but contamination and dead cells. The lake was waiting beneath 3,700 meters of ice, waiting for technology to improve, waiting for methods that could sample it without contamination, waiting for humans to develop the capability to truly explore what they'd spent half a century reaching. 54 years to drill there, perhaps 54 more to understand it. And even then, understanding would be incomplete, limited by the impossibility of truly knowing what exists in 5,400 cubic kilometers of dark water, accessed through a single borehole. Lake Vostok had been reached, but its secrets remained locked beneath the ice, tantalizing and frustrating in equal measure. January 8th, 2024, Moscow. Russian glaciologist Alexei Akakin stood before a screen, showing radar data from Lake Vostok, and realized everything they'd assumed about the lake was wrong. The imaging showed massive convection cells, water circulating throughout the entire lake volume, driven by temperature differentials between the geothermally heated bottom and the frigid ice ceiling above. The circulation was slow, perhaps centimeters per second, but continuous. Over thousands of years, every molecule of water in the lake would cycle from deepest bottom to highest ceiling and back again. This wasn't a stagnant pool sealed under ice. This was a dynamic system that had been operating for millions of years, and if life existed in Lake Vostok, it would have been distributed throughout 5,400 cubic kilometers by currents that never stopped flowing. Akakin had spent 15 years analyzing Vostok ice cores. He'd assumed the lake was stratified. Cold water at top, warmer at bottom, minimal mixing. The radar data destroyed that assumption completely. Lake Vostok was alive with motion, mixing continuously, creating an environment radically different from what anyone had predicted, and nobody knew what that meant for possible organisms living there. This revelation came 67 years after Andrey Kapitsa first detected anomalous seismic reflections in 1957. 67 years of drilling, analysis, and slowly discovering that Lake Vostok was stranger and more complex than each previous understanding suggested. The contamination problem that had plagued early sample analysis remained unsolved, but was being approached differently. By 2023, Sergei Bulat's team had analyzed samples from 5 separate drilling seasons, extracting frozen lake water from different depths in the borehole. The DNA sequences showed consistent patterns across all samples, the same unknown genetic signatures appearing repeatedly. Statistical analysis suggested these consistent unknowns were probably genuine lake organisms rather than random contamination. Contamination should vary between samples. Lake organisms should appear consistently. The pattern matched lake life, not surface contamination, but probably wasn't proof, and culturing attempts still failed completely. Whatever existed in Lake Vostok, if anything existed, wouldn't grow in laboratory conditions. The organisms were so specialized to their environment that replicating it in a lab was beyond current capability. Then in 2020, a different approach yielded breakthrough results. Instead of trying to culture organisms, researchers analyzed the DNA for functional genes, genetic sequences that coded for specific metabolic processes. They found genes for chemosynthesis, for metabolizing sulfur compounds, for surviving high oxygen concentrations, for operating at near freezing temperatures. These weren't random DNA fragments. These were functional genetic systems for surviving in conditions that match Lake Vostok exactly. Hyperoxic water, near freezing cold, permanent darkness, chemical energy from dissolved minerals rather than sunlight. The organisms were real. They had to be. Contamination wouldn't show this level of environmental specialization. These genetic signatures represented life adapted specifically to Lake Vostok conditions over millions of years of evolution. Publication of these results in 2021 shifted scientific consensus decisively. Lake Vostok almost certainly contained living microbial ecosystems, not just dead DNA, not just contamination, but active organisms metabolizing, reproducing, evolving in an environment isolated from Earth's surface biosphere for 15 million years. The implications cascaded outward. If Lake Vostok harbored life, the other 400 plus subglacial lakes identified beneath Antarctic ice probably did too. Antarctica's subglacial environment wasn't dead space beneath the ice sheet. It was a vast hidden biosphere potentially containing significant microbial biomass evolving separately from surface life. And the existence of this biosphere answered a question that had driven decades of work. Could life exist in subsurface oceans on other worlds? Europa, Jupiter's moon, has an ocean beneath 10 to 30 kilometers of ice. Enceladus, Saturn's moon, has subsurface seas that vent water into space. Both environments are cold, dark, isolated from atmospheric contact. Both were long considered too extreme for life. Lake Vostok proved otherwise, proved that life could thrive in permanent darkness under kilometers of ice, proved that isolation wasn't sterilization, proved that the conditions on Europa and Enceladus, conditions that seemed impossibly hostile, might actually support living ecosystems. NASA's Europa Clipper mission, launched in 2024, carried instruments designed specifically to detect biosignatures in ice and water samples. The mission planning referenced Lake Vostok explicitly. The detection methods, the contamination protocols, the statistical approaches for distinguishing life from non-life, all were developed and tested using Vostok data. Lake Vostok had become humanity's analog for exploring alien oceans. Every challenge faced at Vostok, penetrating ice without contamination, detecting life in samples, proving indigenous organisms weren't contamination, would be faced again at Europa, multiplied by the impossibility of sending humans and the 600 million kilometer communication delay. If we couldn't successfully prove what lived in Lake Vostok, we had no chance at Europa. The technology was improving. By 2023, autonomous cryobots had successfully descended 1,200 meters through Greenland ice, maintaining sterile conditions and navigating independently. Still far from Vostok's 3,700 meter depth, but progress was measurable and accelerating. Engineering teams were solving the critical problems: power systems using radioisotope thermal generators, navigation using inertial guidance and ice-penetrating radar, communication via fiber optic tether, sterilization protocols that could survive years of operation. Each challenge was yielding to focused development. Estimates suggested a Vostok-capable cryobot by the early 2030s. Not for initial access, the Russian borehole remained functional, but for exploring other parts of the lake, sampling locations beyond the single-point access by drilling. Because the fundamental limitation remained, everything known about Lake Vostok came from one location, in a lake 250 kilometers long and 50 kilometers wide. Declaring understanding based on one borehole was like analyzing Earth's oceans from a single bottle dropped in the Pacific. Lake Vostok could have regional variations, different microbial communities in geothermally active zones versus cold zones, chemosynthetic ecosystems near bedrock vents, temperature and chemistry gradients creating distinct ecological niches. The convection patterns Ikakin's radar had revealed suggested complexity far beyond what a single sampling point could capture. The complete exploration of Lake Vostok, multiple access points, autonomous underwater vehicles, distributed sensor networks, would require decades and international cooperation on scales difficult to maintain. But the scientific return would be extraordinary. Understanding how life evolved in complete isolation, what forms it could take, what environments could support it, and there was something else, something beyond science. Lake Vostok represented human capability pushed to absolute limits. Andrey Kapitsa detecting impossible seismic returns in 1957 and refusing to dismiss them. Soviet drill crews spending decades in the coldest place on Earth, advancing meters per year, losing health to kerosene fumes and frostbite. Russian scientists keeping the project alive through economic collapse. Sergei Bulat analyzing samples for 20 years, searching for proof in contaminated ice. Hundreds of people had devoted careers to Lake Vostok. Some died before seeing results. Others sacrificed health, time, normal lives to advance a borehole through ice toward water nobody could see or touch or prove existed. The lake had been declared impossible, then unreachable, then unsamplable, without contamination. Each declaration had been proven wrong through work measured in decades, through stubborn refusal to accept limitations. By 2024, Lake Vostok was confirmed reality. The genetic evidence showed life. The chemical data showed a viable ecosystem. The physical data revealed dynamic circulation creating complexity nobody had predicted. But complete understanding, knowing what actually swam or metabolized or reproduced in that dark water, remained years or decades away. The lake was waiting, as it had waited for 15 million years, waiting for technology capable of exploring it properly, waiting for methods that could sample without destroying what they found, waiting for humans patient enough to pursue understanding across generations. 67 years from detection to current knowledge, perhaps another 67 to comprehensive understanding. The timescale was geological, measured in careers and generations, in slow accumulation of data that gradually transformed mystery into knowledge. And beneath 3,700 meters of Antarctic ice, Lake Vostok remained, alive with circulating water and possibly with organisms adapted to conditions unlike anywhere else on Earth. A world within our world that we'd spent nearly 7 decades reaching, and might spend another century understanding. The exploration had only begun, but every answer revealed deeper questions. What metabolism did the organisms use? How had they evolved in isolation? What did their biochemistry look like? Were they related to surface life, or had they diverged so far that they represented something genuinely alien? The answers waited in darkness, in pressurized water, in an environment humans couldn't visit and could barely sample. Waited for technology that didn't quite exist yet. Waited for the stubbornness that had driven the project from 1957 to 2024 to continue driving it for decades more. Because that's what Lake Vostok had always demanded. Absolute commitment across timescales, longer than individual careers, across setbacks that would have killed normal projects, across impossibilities that became merely difficult through decades of grinding work. The lake had been reached, had yielded its first secrets reluctantly, and would yield the rest only to those patient and stubborn enough to keep asking questions long after reasonable people would have given up. Lake Vostok, an alien world on Earth, buried under ice, isolated for 15 million years, possibly alive, definitely waiting. The greatest discovery in Antarctic science, and the exploration had barely started.